The Americans moving coffins. That's what they called them. And then they laughed. In 1941 to 1942, rumors drifted through German headquarters. The Americans were sketching a light tank, thinly armored, with an open turret. A joke. Suicide. In the meeting rooms, officers tapped their pens against maps, pointing at the Tigers, the Panthers, the 88mm barrels that ruled the battlefield skies. Only thick steel survived. Who would dare drive into that kind of firepower in a tin box? They laughed, but soon enough they would regret their hasty judgment. Poland collapsed in just 5 weeks. Red lines slashed endlessly across Allied command maps. Telephone lines crackled with urgency. Words of reassurance faded, replaced by long silences. They called it a temporary organized withdrawal. Soon there was no organization left to withdraw. By the very next summer, mighty France also fell. 6 weeks, no more. Trenches, military highways, ammunition depots, reserve units. All that remained was dust on tank treads and black smoke on the horizon. In dim conference rooms, Allied generals stared at one another, too drained to justify themselves. Every defensive plan crumpled into nothing but wrinkled paper in their hands. Orders to move came slower than the enemy's armoured columns. The Maginot Line, pride of a generation, was outflanked in days. Not because it was weak, but because the enemy didn't even bother to stop. Blitzkrieg didn't smash the front door. It slipped around, walked in the back gate, and snapped the key right out of the homeowner's hand. And of course, on the other side, German confidence soared higher than ever. Their tactics proven, their tank crews and infantry meshed like oiled gears. Battle reports streamed ceaselessly into headquarters. The Allies faced the question that mattered most. How do you stop an enemy that moves like lightning, that breaks a nation in weeks? Without an answer, the battlefield would be decided before the Americans even arrived, late by half a beat, firing into empty space. One demand rose above all others and could not be ignored. A new tactic was needed, one that could break the enemy's tempo. Not someday, now. Before the maps changed colour again. And in that moment, one man stepped forward and shifted the course of the war. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce walked into the meeting room. Broad shoulders, straight back, uniform squared away. Sun-darkened face, square jaw, the steady eyes of a seasoned cavalryman. Bruce had watched Poland fall in 5 weeks, France in 6. He saw those defeats differently, not in terms of sheer force or numbers, but in how the enemy slipped through, bypassed, struck, and vanished before counterattack orders even reached the line. On that battlefield, whoever lagged by half a beat was already lost. Some in the room argued for more steel, bigger guns, thicker walls. Bruce slowly raised his eyes. "We cannot out-tiger the tiger." His voice was quiet, but the words dropped like lead. Pens froze mid-stroke. He went on. "If the enemy wins by armour and range, we will never catch up playing their game. We must take what they don't have. Time." He opened a folder. Inside was his plan, written clear and direct. Seek, strike, destroy. No static defense. No contest of endurance. No standing still to take blows. American forces would be organized into light, mobile units. Crews trained to read terrain, seize firing positions in seconds, fire 3 to 5 rounds, then vanish, no less than 200 yards away. Thin armor, he admitted, but speed will replace it. Not with numbers on blueprints, but with seconds stolen from the enemy. The protests came sharp, hard-edged. "You're sending our boys to their deaths. A tin can against an 88? An open turret? Who would even sit in that?" Bruce's voice never wavered. "Yes, the risk is high. But look around. Did thick armor save anyone these past weeks?" He shoved the retreat reports toward them, the endless regroup orders that never arrived. "We are not short of steel. We are short of time. We will buy it with speed, with initiative, with the right to choose the ground and the moment of battle." Some sighed. Others smirked. Bruce noted every reaction. That night he stayed late. He pared down his presentation, stripped off the polish, added terrain arrows, marked firing points and withdrawal routes. The next morning, the decision was signed, not out of full agreement, but out of urgency, by a nation that knew it was already behind the pace. Bruce's papers left the conference room and went to Detroit. In the lit-up factories, engineers unfolded the blueprints. Low profile, light body, stripped of thick armor, keeping only what was needed to move and fire. An aircraft engine was considered for the steel frame. On the drawing tables, the lines began to connect. Hull, open turret, suspension, transmission. No drums, no slogans, just pencil strokes flowing faster and faster, like the stride of a predator learning to hunt. Bruce stood by the window, watching a thin cloud slip across the Pentagon's roof. He knew some thought him reckless, even irresponsible. But he also knew something else. Without the gamble, defeat was certain. At the Buick plant, the lights burned all night in the days that followed. Steel frames lay on the conveyor, waiting to be given life. Every detail went against industry habit. Instead of casting thick, they shaved thin. Instead of adding shields, they left the turret open. A solution against the grain, but in step with Bruce's question, speed above all else. Various gun calibers were tested to match the battlefield's demands. At last, they settled on 76 millimeters, powerful enough to kill with a flank shot, and more importantly, light enough for the chassis to keep flying forward. On paper, the incremental caliber upgrades rose like rungs of a ladder, each rung a rejection of the old thicker or die way of thinking. The machine's heart was lifted from the skies. The Wright R975 Whirlwind, a 9-cylinder radial aircraft engine, 400 horsepower. They fitted it into the low steel body. To spare the driver from wrestling heavy pedals, Buick used General Motors' Torquematic transmission, an automatic gearbox that shifted smoothly while the vehicle swerved, climbed embankments, or barreled downhill. A torsion bar suspension was added, like new tendons, keeping the hull steady at speed, the sights from bouncing wildly off rough ground. Spring 1943, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. On the test track, a low-slung hull, open turret, painted pale grey, stood still as stone before the moment of motion. The driver engaged gear. The radial engine drew a deep breath, then cracked to life. The hull leapt forward. 0 to 30 in 11 seconds, the cold figure logged in the test book, but to those nearby, it was the sound of wind pouring into the turret's open bowl. At the far corner, an officer tugged his visor cap down against the dust, jotting an extra line. Stable aim at high speed. Passed. Meanwhile, across the ocean, German troops still trusted the old formula. Thick armor meant survival. They leveled their 80s, parked their tanks at the edge of forests, and waited for prey to wander into range. Here, the Americans embraced a calculated fragility. They chose to trade everything for two essentials: top speed and acceleration. No need to be wrapped in steel when you could be wrapped in motion. The automatic transmission freed the driver to think only of the escape route. The torsion suspension kept the gunner's sight clear while the hull lunged. The aircraft engine yanked the whole machine forward like an arrow loosed from a bow. The final signing day passed quietly. No cannons, no flags, only one short name written on the board: M18 Hellcat. The closing lines of the file emphasized what legend would repeat for years. Top speed, 55 miles per hour, the fastest of World War II. The rest was silence, steel waiting for the hunt. And the M18 would not wait long for its first kill. Anzio, May 1944. A foggy morning. Salt air mixed with the smell of powder. Overhead, the Apennines sealed the horizon with grey rock slopes, narrow passes, twisting grades. German engines roared on the hairpin climbs. Panthers, Panzer IVs, gasped for breath. Transmissions ground, treads clawed stone. Every meter gained was a groan of steel. The Hellcats of the 894th Tank Destroyer Battalion lay silent on the hillside. Low hulls, open turrets. The R-975 Radial growled softly, like a beast drawing lungs tight before the leap. The commander bent over his binoculars, peering past the oak edge. A panther crawled out of the curve, its flank exposed for a fleeting instant. "Take the side!" "Ready." The voice dropped into the turret, short, dry. The driver clenched the wheel. The Talkmatic answered. The Hellcat burst from the brush. The hull bounced lightly over the ridge. The gunner pulled the trigger. The blast hammered the cliff face, echoing across the valley. Gunsmoke slapped into faces. Flame licked across the Panther's side. The second shot. Armor plates flared sparks. The German crew panicked, cranking the turret as slow as a door stuck in mud. The third shot. The Hellcat's barrel snapped back, the shell casing clattering across the floor. "Displace!" a single command. The driver yanked the gear. The Hellcat reversed at 30 miles an hour. Wind lashed faces through the open turret. The hull slid back into a covered ditch. Above, the German 88 roared, but too late. A burst of smoke and dirt tore apart the edge of the woods the Hellcat had just abandoned. On the ground, only fresh track marks and 3 searing hot shell casings remained. The terrain gave no favor to the heavyweights. The mountain road strangled the Panther. Around the next curve, another exposed its flank. A second Hellcat slid into position, repeating the hunting rhythm. Fire, 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 back. The engine whined high. The torsion bars held the hull steady over the rough stone. The commander marked a pencil cross on the map, the last firing point. Next, a rise 200 yards west. Shift position. Down in the valley, German soldiers looked up, cursing into the hail of dust. Machine guns raked blindly at the tree line. Useless. Every time they thought they'd fixed the firing angle, the low silhouette evaporated, leaving only the smoke of the last 88 volley. In a notebook, a German sergeant scrawled a short line. Too fast. Counterfire ineffective. Underlined twice. The mountain road was so narrow that half a foot wrong meant a wrecked tank. The driver skimmed his tracks along the cliff edge, sweat mixing with grease dripping under vibration. The gunner kept the sights pinned on the wavering steel flank. The loader heaved casings out, his hands red with heat. The commander leaned half out of the open turret, eyes sweeping the oak fringe. A Panzer IV nosed forward, hesitating at the sight of another burning wreck. 1 second of doubt, 1 second too long. The 76mm answered like a hammer striking a nail. Behind them, the German gun spat flame again. Rock shards rattled against the open turret. A big fragment rang clang off the thin armor rim, then bounced away. The commander ducked low, back, positions spent. The Hellcat slipped off to a side path, sinking into the trees. For a moment, the wind stilled. Above, sunlight tore clouds into ribbons, flashing steel edges bright. The fight went on, the advantage firmly in American hands. The battle at Anzio ended without banners raised, only the smell of burnt iron, the forest's whisper returning, and new black scars along the slopes. For the Germans, the feeling left behind was alien. They had not been beaten in a duel. They had been hunted. Every turret turn found nothing. Every shot prepared fell on a hollow tree line with only cooling smoke, ghosts moving in rock and mist. The Hellcat had passed its first trial by fire. It did not give safety. It gave moments, enough to live, enough to kill, enough to leave before paying the price. And from the Apennines, from that fateful day, in the margins of many Panzer crews' diaries, a new word appeared: Hellcat. Next came Lorraine, September 1944. Fog country, thick, white, heavy as cotton. Wet meadows, barbed wire glistening. Patton drove his men forward. The Germans counterattacked around Nancy. The 5th Panzer Army pushed into the white shroud. Panthers and Panzer IVs crawled slow. Engines whined. Treads scraped mud. German gunners strained through fogged sights. Orders went down. Hold formation. Don't fire until certain. Everything slowed in that silent fog. At the edge of an apple orchard, low silhouettes crouched like predators. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion held their breath. The commander's hands tightened on binoculars. "Wait for the flank." The words cut into the fog like a knife. A Panther eased out from the village road, its side exposed for an instant. "Go!" The Hellcat lunged from the tree line. The hull skimmed forward. The 76mm dipped slightly. Boom. Fire tore through the Panther's side. Boom. Another. Black smoke wound around the apple tops. Boom. Finished. "Displace!" The automatic transmission bit gear. The Hellcat slid back, vanishing behind the hedgerow. Only churned mud and 3 smoking shell casings left. The fog closed in. Silence again. A Panzer IV groped forward, turret swinging left, right, slow, confused. Another Hellcat slid into place, keeping the rhythm. Clean, efficient, deadly. Platoon leader Edwin Leiper pinned a map to his thigh, sketching quick flanking arrows. "Let the lead pass. Hit the tail." Hartmann's crew took the coordinates. They hugged the ditch bank, pulling wind into the open turret. As the Panther's turret began to swing, Hartmann squeezed the trigger. Flame spat like a black mouth opening. "Back!" The Hellcat surged in reverse, treads whipping water into mist. German shells slammed into the embankment. Late, wasted, useless. A panzer company tried to form an L-shaped kill line. Static crackled. "Hold position! Do not pursue!" But the fog warped all distance. Hellcat engines flitted on the wind, as if from 3 directions. German crews trained their barrels on the noise, fired at the noise, hit nothing. On the village road, the German command tank paused 1 beat too long. A Hellcat ripped through the fog, streaked black across the lane, drove a shell into its flank, then vanished as if it had never been there. Hartmann dropped another Panther, trying to veer around the wreck of its comrade. Its turret turned as if drowning in mud. Boom! The Hellcat's barrel jerked back. A flash of fire, then gone. 2 Germans scrambled out the hatch, tumbling into wet earth. By noon, the light was still dim, hazy. The smell of smoke and oil clung tight around the Nazi troops. German soldiers coughed, choking, running as they searched for the enemy's shadow. They saw no clear shape, only the results: burning tanks, shattered formations, orders dying on the wind. Gun crews tried to call for artillery. By the time they read out the coordinates, the target had already shifted. It was that sudden appearing and vanishing that threw the Germans into confusion. Illusions of numbers spread. They reported many Hellcats. In truth, just a few, moving so quickly that one crew thought they were 3. By early afternoon, the German line collapsed completely. A few desperate crews charged through the white curtain. A Hellcat blocked the village edge, firing across the apple orchard, then sliding back behind a barn. Another circled the side path, striking the rear of one, trying to turn. Everything happened fast, precise, cold. When the wind shifted, the fog thinned. The scene emerged, merciless and clear. Panthers strewn across the wet fields, turrets twisted aside, black smoke stabbing upward into grey skies. In the after-action reports, the numbers closed like a verdict. 39 German tanks destroyed, 11 damaged. American losses, 4 Hellcats. A lopsided ratio, one of the most unequal tank duels of the war, proof of how effective the tactic was. Silence returned to the fields. Ripe apples fell into mud with soft thuds, like the last punctuation marks. German soldiers leaned against stalled vehicles, staring through burned paint, unable to grasp where their enemy had gone. "No one can stop them," one muttered, voice raw from smoke. "They come, and then they're gone." The cold numbers could never capture the shock. The Germans had believed thick armour and heavy firepower ruled the battlefield, yet their proud Panthers had become prey. War is not always decided by absolute strength, but by daring and timing. A slim machine, driven with courage and precision, shattered the illusion of Nazi invincibility. For the 5th Panzer Army, this was disaster. Panthers and support vehicles burned in the fog. At first, German generals tried blaming the weather, the chaos, poor coordination. But by the end of 1944, when they captured an intact M18 Hellcat, the numbers exposed the harsh truth. The Panther weighed 45 tons, the Hellcat barely over 18. The German tank carried armor thick enough to shrug off most Allied shells, while the Hellcat's plating, at its strongest, was less than 4 inches. By logic, weight and protection should have been decisive. Reality said otherwise. The Hellcat could run 55 miles per hour, nearly twice the Panther. Its power-to-weight ratio made it closer to a race car than a self-propelled gun. Its deadliest edge wasn't even raw speed on the straightaway, but a figure few noticed: turret traverse time. The Panther's hydraulics depended on the engine. At high RPM, a full 360-degree rotation took 19 seconds. Standing still, that time stretched close to a minute. By contrast, the Hellcat's independent hydraulic system spun its turret in just 24 seconds, engine speed irrelevant. Paired with its mobility, this was the killing edge. At top speed, a Hellcat could cover 400 yards in 16 seconds. While a Panther's crew wrestled their turret around, the Hellcat had already fired, relocated, and was halfway to its next position. Shoot and scoot wasn't reckless, it was calculated. Picture a stopwatch. The Germans spot movement, call alarm, swing the turret, align the gun. 20, 30, 40 seconds gone, and by then, the Hellcat had fired, slipped back, and disappeared over the rise. The German shot landed in emptiness. For German crews used to patient gunnery duels, it was a nightmare. Their weapons were built to kill at range, not to chase phantoms. Facing the Hellcat was like stepping into a ring with an opponent who refused to stand still, striking, then vanishing before you could answer. The Hellcat turned the battlefield into a contest of reaction speed. And in that race, Germany's most advanced machines were simply too slow. Reading the test reports, German officers must have realized their entire doctrine was crumbling. They built tanks to endure shells and win drawn-out slugfests. But what use was that if the enemy never stood still? What use was armor if rounds slammed into your flanks or rear before you could even turn? For the Americans, the battle had proved the point. The Hellcat was not just fast, it made speed into armor. For the Germans, it was a reckoning too late. 1944 closed, and both sides braced for trials even harsher still. Ardennes, December 1944. The sky sank into fog and snow. Germany staked everything on one final gamble. Pine forests hung heavy, white and wet. The Reich threw its last counterblow. The 2nd Panzer Division crawled through the narrow valleys toward Bastogne. Noville stood in the mist. In the village, only 4 Hellcats of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. 4 low hulls, open turrets, freezing steel. The German column came on slow. Panthers, Panzer IVs, guns towed behind, headlights glowing yellow like animal eyes. Tracks ground snow like sandpaper. Turrets groped blindly through the fog. They still believed in weight, in numbers. Move out. One Hellcat slipped from a hedgerow, skimming the dark ditch. The 76mm dropped. Boom. Fire tore into the white. A Panther staggered, flames bursting from its flank. Boom. Another shot. Back. The tank reversed. Vanished. On the icy road, German shells smashed into a corner wall. Too late by a beat. Another Hellcat slid across the churchyard, hiding behind a mossy stone wall. Wait for it to pass. Hit the tail. German wheels screeched on the ice. The turret turned, slow. Boom. Fire bent upward like a black flag. Then instantly, tracks clawed the snow, the hull backing into a gap between houses. The Germans swung their barrels toward the smoke and found only emptiness. The fog thickened. but explosions snapped from 3 directions. Illusion became numbers. Each Hellcat's shift made 3 in the enemy's mind. Reports piled in. An overwhelming number of American tanks are threatening us. In truth, there were only 4. One German squad tried to flank across the snowy fields. They ran through the wind, overcoats flying. A Hellcat crouched behind a haystack, barrel peeking through the edge. Boom! The lead tank folded on its steel knees. German infantry hit the ground, firing back by reflex. Rounds chewed wooden walls, snow burst up like smoke. They cursed. They could not see the shooter. When they turned, another shot crashed from the fence line at their right. Darkness fell early. Fog did not lift, only thickened into a heavy blanket. Flares carved white streaks into the haze. The Hellcats prowled near old positions, but never in the same place. Each sweep of light found them shifted. "It's like striking shadows," a German officer snapped into the radio. "We cannot engage effectively." The diary line later was sharper. "Encountered heavy resistance from highly mobile tank destroyers, unable to engage effectively for 48 hours. 2 days, just 4 small American tanks held up an entire panzer division. Every minute they bought was mortar and wire added to Bastonia's walls. There, the 101st Airborne dug in, strung wire, set mortars. Time itself froze into fortification. The road through Noville was pinched shut by flashes that came and vanished. On the second morning, the wind shifted, the fog thinned. At the village edge, snow covered the black hulks of burned panzers in a white crust. Turrets twisted, tracks snapped, thin columns of smoke stretched against the steel sky. The highway was pocked with frozen shell craters. A Hellcat rolled quietly from a farmyard corner, engine coughing low, then disappeared into the frost-laden trees, like the last stroke of ink across a white canvas. The Germans stood still in the snow, coats crusted with frost. They looked around and saw broken tracks vanishing into mist. No target left to avenge. Only empty ground where the target had been. A sergeant whispered to no one in particular. "They come, and then they're gone." His words dropped into the snow, lying there heavy and cold. Noville kept the sound of wind, whipping tin roofs, and the smell of burned steel. The Hellcats still growled in the fog, few, fragile, but always in the right place, at the right time. In sharp contrast to the battlefield, Camp Hood, Texas. The smell of burned steel replaced by red dust. The cracked earth underfoot, sky blazing hard and blue. Here, what had brought victory in the fog of the Ardennes was honed into reflex. The driver sat low behind the wheel, shirt stiff with salt, eyes narrowed in the sun. Ahead lay an S-curve, packed dirt, gravel scattered. Less than 18 tons of steel slithered into the bend like a hungry cat forced through a narrow gap. The instructor's voice barked, "Dive in! Hold the throttle! Don't fear rolling, fear slowing." The automatic transmission swallowed the revs, freeing the driver's hands to hug the run. Track squealed. The tail swept a red arc of dust. The gunner was not allowed to worship perfection. "Forget ceremony," the commander ordered. "Better on time than dead on." Targets popped up, dropped away. Sights shuddered in the shimmer of heat. Fire, fire, fire. Pull back 200 yards. Repeat. Repeat until shoulders went numb, hands grew calloused, and the very idea of staying still drained out of the body. A miss was acceptable, if it was followed by moving at the exact right second. The commander learned to read ground like a chessboard. The board was bare training fields, dotted with low ridges, sand cuts, and model houses. First lesson, choose the fallback before you choose the firing point. Second, always see 2 moves ahead. Never stop on the move you just made. He tapped his pencil against the map, marking open angles where a flank could be caught, arrows bending back to a mound within 200 yards, then another arrow, off to the left, against the enemy's inevitable shelling of the old position. In the open-topped turret, sunlight poured down like a river of heat. Sweat salted the helmet straps, dust clung to the neck. The radial engine's growl drummed in their ribs. The crew spoke little. One hand signal meant back. A snap of the fingers meant shift angle. A nod meant fire. They turned it into discipline. Then came the psychological lesson. On the table, the instructor placed an empty 88mm shell. He didn't threaten. He simply slid it to the edge of the open turret. Metal scraped lightly on steel. This doesn't need a direct hit. One fragment is enough. You'll live by seconds, not by armor. No one laughed. They all returned to the range, where the harsh sun sharpened everything, even the truth. The stopwatch drill ran in the afternoons. Targets appeared without warning. The commander counted silently in his head. The gunner squeezed the trigger. The driver was already twisting the wheel for retreat before the shell casing hit the floor. As the hull slid back, the loader shifted his weight, keeping the tank steady for the recoil's jolt. Everything came down to speed, but not panic. Speed here meant clarity. Choices cut sharp as a razor's edge. Scenarios grew harder, firing across model houses, relocating while tracks sank in soft sand. Engine kill simulations forcing the crew to recover within 3 breaths. Sometimes, mock enemy fire slammed into the spot they had just vacated. Dust bursting high, fragments rattling against the open turret. Someone would laugh dryly. Too late. The words drifted into the engine noise, like confirmation that their method was sound. On brakes, young soldiers tightened laces, strapped knee braces, breathed in the smell of oil like the smell of home. They talked about the cleanest escape routes, about firing angles that forced an enemy turret to turn the longest, about how wind might push smoke aside, buying half a beat more to disappear. No one spoke the word safe. It didn't exist in the program. They spoke of rhythm. They believed rhythm would lead to final victory. Not by one crushing blow, but by thousands of moments struck true. When the sun sank, tank shadows stretched across the range. Dust settled. Engines cooled. The instructor gathered target boards, shoved them into a crate. Before leaving, he paused, wrapped his helmet against the turret rim, spoke softly so only 4 men could hear. Remember the rule. He didn't need to remind them. The rule lived in their muscles. Fire 3 to 5. Fall back 200. Shift angle. Don't be there when the shell lands. In the night tents, commanders spread maps, pencils red and blue, sketching retreat lines like blood vessels in a steel body. Gunners polished barrels until their reflections glimmered on the metal lip. Drivers sat on steps outside, eyes lifted to a sky thick with stars nailed deep into black. Far across the ocean, bombs still fell on battlefields. Here, the sand stayed hot, the wind stayed dry, and a generation of Hellcats grew up like blades being tempered, daring, disciplined, embracing fragility as part of the design. Mornings at Camp Hood began with whistles and red dust. The rhythm of fire, withdraw, shift angle had seeped into their bodies. But when transport hatches closed, when the ocean lay silent beneath the ships, that rhythm entered another war, uneven, muddled, full of tasks with no name. In Europe, the Hellcat had proven itself. Where there was open ground, ridges, fog, and roads long enough for a charge and a vanish, it shone. But most of the time, the battlefield offered no such perfect moments. Hellcats were dragged along with infantry, smashing fortifications, covering assaults, firing indirectly like artillery. Open turrets caught bricks and shrapnel. Crews leaned out over the armor rim to point targets for rifle platoons. By technique, they managed. Strong engines, smooth transmissions, 76mm guns able to crack walls. But each shot struck at their original faith. The tank was born to hunt, not to dig. Then the war shifted to the Pacific. Philippines, 1944. No valleys, no orchards. Ahead lay jungle, constant rain, sucking mud. Roads were narrow scars cut through cane and bamboo, bogged to the knees. Here, speed was a cruel joke. The Hellcat crawled a few yards, then sank half its tracks. The radial engine roared in its steel chest, but the power was swallowed whole by mud. Each 200-yard retreat in the manual shrank to half a length, then stopped. The enemy was different too. The Japanese did not bring heavy Panthers, nor did they build long-range kill zones for the 76mm to exploit. They crept close, slashing through wire, slipping under brush. The open turret, an advantage in open fields, became a bare well. At night, shadows slipped inside the perimeter, grenades dropped quick, satchel charges hurled into the crew compartment, shouts cut short, engines choked silent. By morning, crews welded makeshift roofs from scrap steel, stretched wire and netting overhead, a rough hide against unseen hands. Welding smoke clung to their shirts, the smell of scorched metal in their lungs. Day after day, Hellcats hauled artillery, escorted convoys, stood guard on the edges of bamboo villages. The 76mm thundered shells into caves, pillboxes, tunnel mouths. In Europe, there were still moments when the Hellcat fit the fight, but as the war dragged on, with mixed operations, ambushes, and unforgiving terrain, the ideal conditions dissolved. The fastest vehicle of the war was shackled to the slowest assignments. The soldiers still carried on, discipline intact, courage unshaken. They gripped the wheel through nights of rain, crawled under mud-choked hulls with a wrench, fired to cover infantry climbing out of bunkers. Yet beneath all that bravery lay an unspoken dissonance between what the machine could do and how it was used. Night in the jungle brought another layer of black. Beneath patched roofs dotted with weld scars, 4 men lay curled, listening to insects scratch at the armor. In Europe, the answer had been clear. Time wins. Here, time thickened like tar, clinging to tracks, bending every formula. From the bottom of the night, the old question returned, heavier now, no longer a theory from the training fields. Did seek, strike, destroy truly fit a war sprawling across jungles, mountains, islands, and cities? Or was it a superbly sharp blade, only when in the right hand and against the right block of wood? What had to come, came. In November 1945, the US Army signed the order dissolving the tank destroyer force. Dry words, politely written, no bugles, no parade, just units told to restructure, warehouses sealed, steel frames stacked. The Hellcat, beloved by its crews for speed, for the feeling of owning every second, became the relic of a doctrine that could not survive the full breadth of war. It had triumphed where battles matched its rhythm, but war seldom offers a stage on cue. Yet that ending was not erasure. It was distillation, illusions stripped away, essence kept. The Americans learned fast, as they had once thrown the Hellcat into combat. Mobility is armor, tempo is firepower. They admitted the flaws in their forecast. The enemy did not always come with massed armor as in Poland or France. The battlefield demanded multi-purpose weapons. But the United States, with flexible tactics and immense industry, was the one power able to pivot, turning lessons into designs, designs into assembly lines, and assembly lines into new doctrine. Across the line, Germany overflowed with engineering genius, yet its heavy armor dogma froze in the formulas of early victories, until time, fuel, and skies heavy with bombs broke it apart. The Hellcat's legacy lived on, not in shoulder patches, but in the silhouettes of post-war machines. The Soviets, remembering their marshes and rivers, built the PT-76, light, amphibious, mobility first. France forged the AMX-13, small, fast, with a swinging turret, echoing, arrive first, fire first, move again. Britain rolled out the CVRT line, Scorpion, Scimitar, swift recon blades that dodged blows. And Germany, once crowned by Tigers and Panthers, turned wholly around with the Leopard 1. Light in its class, quick, favouring mobility over extra inches of steel. A quiet admission that in the new age, Dodging was worth as much as absorbing. For the United States, the Hellcat closed as a costly experiment paid in full, but its heart beat on in military thought. Fast combined arms coordination, decisions ruled by opportunity more than fortresses, industry leveraged to bend the tempo of war itself. On a battlefield of lightning strikes, the side with factories and the will to turn pages quickly would rewrite the rules. Germany had superb tanks and veteran crews, but when the rules shifted from armor duels to tempo races, from arenas to mazes, the edge passed to those who could redesign themselves, and America did that best. The Hellcat not only shattered German myths in a few foggy fields, it wrote a short line for the century that followed. Armor isn't measured only in steel, it's measured in time. Every second gained by pulling back at the right instant, every second bought by shifting angle, every second that forced the enemy to fire into emptiness. That was armor too, thin yet strong, invisible yet real. That armor slipped into manuals, into blueprints, into the switches pressed by young officers in modern machines. A quiet exhibition hall, clean cement underfoot. The M18 Hellcat rests there, smaller than most expect, its open turret mute. Paint faded, metal breathing the smell of age. Visitors circle, read a short plaque, move on. But for those who once studied Lorraine's maps, who smelled Ardennes snow, who felt Texas wind scrape across an open turret, they pause longer. In that silence echoes something faint. The radial engines growl, tracks biting dirt, 3 booming shots, and a tank already gone before the shell lands. An unfair weapon, perhaps. Yet it was that unfairness, the ability to choose ground, set tempo, force the enemy to fight by its rules, that opened the road. The Hellcat closed as a thin-bodied machine, but the lesson it left was thicker than steel. In war, as in industry, whoever controls time controls the fight.